necessary force in order to win requires California to be the ones who acquire market price or exceed the value of the alternative markets, which facilitates a price more desirable under their logic if they had jurisdiction to have better valued contract schedules than the alternative. So the last line of the 7 layers projected schedule has to be able to be exceeded in value. It has to be able to produce more value for David, or it's not a value at all. And that valuation having to be met at market price is David's minimum human decency, unless it is competed with under a bartering negotiation with some kind of bidding war. Now, if they get in a bidding war, they have to win. They are necessary force in order to win, so they have to beat any bartering war. So if the subject is 50 billion, they have to get 51 billion. If the subject is 55 billion, they have to get 56 billion. If the subject is 68 billion, they have to reach 69 billion. And that contract schedule includes the position of themselves in distributing of the obstructed contract schedule of them having to have met that qualifying nut. And that includes the position of promotions of their celebrities, which they have to provide as hosting an insurance system, which would allow them to host extended weekends or 3 days at a time meetings, which would have to, at a minimum, exist at David's living condition or a little bit below. At which point, him being in a traveling state cannot go too far below what he would have been normal to, and as their active competition with each other would actively compel them to invest into the cost of business, they would exclusively, as talent, are the heads or hosts of the insurance system, would have to be living at those locations so that they can invest in the cost of business of improving those living conditions so that they can host those meetings, which facilitates the minimum value. Now, their acceleration in popularity by their alternative means of profits, such as their acting careers, would be a necessary qualifier, which makes them famous enough for them to be the face or the host chosen, which would be invested in and fully insured. So California has to arrange through David's brokerage the insurance for these living conditions and the material living conditions and the contract schedule. And since David's interest with them as a customer is actively using the service, his interest with the people whose value isn't the increase of credit for California because David's paying for the services himself. The subject is them having personal influence, such as gaining friendships or personal advantages with him, as their social negotiations and settlements and customs and norms would have to actively develop in favor of them having that influence, which is essential to California choosing them on that contract schedule, which they would have to set up the superior contract meetings in those locations in order for it to have been justified, which they have to define their billionaire living condition standards in that due diligence, at which point their alternative acting or other forms of income would actively have to uh, take them away for an extended period of time while they do the other work and it's being hosted. Now, the off season would have the insurance owner of the company, which most often would be a wife or something, would actively have to maintain the rest of it while the off season of them working is happening, which would not bring in the primary objective meeting contracts, as it would consistently be maintained, and they, controlling their own schedule, can come up with whatever infinite nonsense that they want on their own mechanism. Now, the fact that California has to meet the market price and David has to serve his client and he's using his client's services means by definition David's interest requires guaranteed high grade contract schedules which stabilize those living conditions for an exponential period of time, which would have to exceed when David would or would not make any agreement that California may or may not need him to do under those various agreements. At which point, the long term settlements would be requiring them to define their own definitions on those objectives and filling out their own dream journals on the brokerage's contracts definition, which is the objective for the brokerage to get them to by getting them contract opportunities for profits in order to fund their endeavor, which facilitates their acceleration to that position, at which point the guaranteed contract schedule would specifically be connected to California's obligation to meet market price. With this stabilizing, they would have active information in order to get loans from various sources in order to prove to them the justification of the increased budget, which would facilitate their upgrades to the amenities and basic living conditions, normalizing the long-term schedule, which would actively be connected through the brokerage, normalize the guaranteed insured profits on all angles. Their submission to discovery would require the admission to that, which includes the obstruction of human decency by the barring of these associations and contracts in the original context, which would have been the basis of their relationship, which is essential for California to have met market price, as that influence is excessive to the credit, which would have been excessive to California's ability to have been paying. So they need the personal influence at the higher levels in order for it to sustain itself at that, uh, to materialize their definition in the brokerage for those exchanges of services at the rates that they would have had to have created themselves. So it's their responsibility to invest into the investigation for the due diligence for them to settle the actual functioning market prices of all of these arrangements and qualifying the normalized budget in a competent business strategy, which would normalize the free market's legal answer to the courts and the IRS and everyone else upon maturity. That indicating the additional services that they would be interested into investing into in the full diversity that would make them interesting and better than the alternative choices, which increases their customer base at that level, at which point the entire function of the travel agency and etc. amenities would actively be invested into as an absolute minimum, qualifying their control over as much of the experience as possible in order to have guaranteed their personalized, tailored experiences as to make themselves unique compared to the alternatives and thus inherently more desirable and thus more influential. Take, for instance, in Australia, David's contracts with the obstructed arrangements with Steve Irwin, which would have actively had to have invested into the Australia Zoo, which would have served as a basis of the School of Hard Knocks alternative scheduling for his finishing of his studies of the environment in those locations, as it would be the functional base of operations for the rest of the studies as he includes the expansion of his investments in his economic treaty with Australia and other essentials. You would understand that the personal tailorized position to that influence would be the active engagement of doing the zoo work or the ranger work or etc. study of the environment work and the superior upgrades to the general economic security, which would actively be upgrading in those interests, would be a specific example of a personal tailorized experience for the School of Hard Knocks on those extended meetings for however long they would be able to contract. Now, the estimate having asserted that David's kingdom would have already been understood by the other nations, would have had a pre-existing treaty with them in the Legend of David companies, which would have facilitated their economic treaties with many of the high-value countries, which normalizing these same exchanges includes their active exchanges with David having to be exceeded at the minimum price, which includes California's obligations to use those other contract treaties to materialize their advantage of hitting their superior contract schedule, defeating the alternatives in their bidding wars, which would materialize the international affair of high luxury, high value members of society who may or may not have otherwise chosen to participate with David in any of the various hoodlum nonsense that he would have had on alternative schedule, which again requires each of these primary insurance for hosting the meetings to have engaged in the investment of their high luxury uniqueness as to have asserted themselves in each of the contract schedule opportunities, which would calculate the total value of accepted worth in each of the contract schedules, overarching value in the distribution of choosing which contract schedule to settle with, funding all of their escapades for the exponential period of time under their contract definitions from their brokerage definitions, settling their long-term goals and stabilizing those standards which are owed to them or they did not meet the market price requirements as a prerequisite to necessary force, which is the meeting of market price. So if you take that into account, you would also have to assert the various advantages, amenities, such as the hobbies, such as David's contract schedule overlapping into the entertainment sector, which would facilitate his active engagement into the creation of movies and TV and the rest of it as a normalized aspect of his schooling, which would certify his ability to engage in the consistent distributions of those expert advice positions, which he would maintain under the obstructed education, which materializes his active relationship with them on and off of screen, which actively increases the preference towards their service to be chosen as the amenity on the schedule over the alternatives as they're actively fighting over the attention of the primary customer, which fills out the rest of their customers at the higher levels, which guarantees their long-term goals and ambitions, qualifying their compliance with California's need to have won that contract or have failed its own standards. And since security is so essential to the function at every level, the insurance would have actively had that, at which point the personal tailorizing of their investment into the security in its diverse forms facilitates an essential aspect which would be reproducible to alternative advantages. And the more they reuse the same materials, the more effective they are at the distribution of each service. So if you use one thing 10 times, you're going to have more function and thus be able to provide the superior services. So their investment into the security would upgrade into normalize of David's military branch uh, and other contract treaties for the security as the purchase of military equipment for the security function would be an essential aspect which would actively be leveraged in the affair of an actual war requiring David's title to actively be leveraged in as those resources are fundamental to his security and the threat of terrorism could happen at any time, requiring the act of repelling at any moment's notice to be personally tailorized to each participant in the arrangements to David's standards, defining their uniqueness in the full diversity of complexities which they are required required to do in order for them to have acquired the minimum standard, facilitating their obligation to invest into their guaranteed minimum living conditions and its entire diversity under those standards, etc.